idea. And I can't assess the book, and it's slightly frustrating because I can't read it, but I think I know what it says. Anyway, it's obviously very timely to talk about this subject this evening, because on Tuesday, we'll be jetting off to Shanghai to follow the story of George Hogg, the triumph and tragedy of his life. And I'll be going along, and I'm very much looking forward to that. In fact, I can't wait. And we live, I think, in an uncertain world. And it's very important that these old memories of friendship are revived and celebrated, because on those depend our relations between China and the UK. On the other hand, I think the world always was uncertain. If I think of the world my parents were born into at the beginning of the 20th century, they faced the Great War, then the Great Depression, then the World War II and the Cold War. So it can be a rough old world. And of course, with World War II starting, they were newly married. And of course, my father faced military service and had to go away. And they were apart for 5 years. Though, of course, there was that other category of people who didn't go away to fight, the pacifists. In World War II, World War I was remarkably recent, and there was a strong pacifist movement. And our country is a civilized country, and it was realized how futile it would be to lock up people who wanted to avoid the draft for valid reasons. So tribunals were set up, and if you conscientiously objected to military service, you could apply to register and be relieved of doing military service. On the other hand, that didn't relieve you of everything. You then had to do alternative service, and the tribunal would tell you what you had to do, usually a choice. For instance, Jack Jones, who you can see there on the book, the tribunal told him to work on the land in food production or join the Friends Ambulance Unit. Let me move on one screen. It's not advancing. So I've lost the sharing. Absolutely what I feared. These things just never work.
Andrew, it should be at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, well, I have. I've clicked that. I've now got a thing showing the things on my screen. I've clicked the one I want. I've clicked share, and nothing happens. Have you got the book, or are you seeing the book?
We can still see the book.
Oh, right. Well, I can't see it. It's gone. So you can see my screen, and I can't. Why can I not? Why can I not see it? And I mean, I should be able to click the advanced arrow on my typewriter thing, and it won't advance. Has it advanced?
I tried to get
no, we can still see.
Are you now seeing another picture?
How do I get back?
Are you still on the red book?
We're still on the red book.
Yes.
I'm just going to find my technician. Excuse me.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me? It's Barnaby. The title simply is a translation of his title. It was a true friend of China, the third and fourth characters.
I shared it. I got the first picture up. It's now disappeared, and it won't advance. I mean, I should advance it by doing. Where's it gone?
You're sharing the screen.
I am, but where is it? I can't see the picture.
Oh.
Right, now why can I not? Why will it not advance?
There you go. Try it now.
What
Try it
trial?
now.
Ah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my son, to whom I'm truly grateful. Why is it that when I do something, it doesn't work? So what was I saying? I'm trying to explain the process for becoming a conscientious objector. Anyway, so people were able to join the Friends Ambulance Unit by being scheduled for alternative service, and a lot of the people in the Friends Ambulance Unit worked in England, very often in hospitals, doing extremely unpleasant work, to the extent that FAU was said to stand for feces and urine. So they were always given the dirtiest work.
Yeah.
And they could apply to go and work abroad. And in fact, the Friends Ambulance Unit worked all over in pretty well every field of conflict: North Africa, Greece, India, China, China being the largest center of their work. And in applying for China, they had to show strong China concern. In other words, be aware of what was happening with the Japanese invasion. And they were required to sign a 3-year contract. So it was a huge commitment to go abroad into very uncertain circumstances, pretty tough. So in the late 40s, in 1941, in late 1941, the first Friends Ambulance Unit went out to China, landing in Rangoon, and found it being bombed by the Japanese. So the Friends Ambulance Unit was in China right from 1941 through to 1952. And it was not just Brits, it was also Canadians, New Zealanders, and Americans. And in fact, in 1946, the running of the Friends Ambulance Unit was handed over from London to the Americans in Philadelphia. So the background history is, of course, the conflict with Japan and China having been at loggerheads for some time, with the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. And then, in effect, the Second World War began in 1932, not 39, as people always say, when China started invading Manchuria. And in 1937, invaded China and ended up holding most of the coastal regions. So with Japan having a stranglehold over the landmass of China, refugees were driven away from the fighting westwards, and the nationalist government moved its capital to Chongqing. So in the process, with the Japanese controlling much of the industrial base, the nationalist government had lost most of its industry. And that's where the CIC, the Chinese Industrial Cooperatives, came in, which is basically what my talk is partly about. And that was a scheme which I'll discuss further, which was created to re-establish industrial work on a local basis. So Japan was isolated because of its invasion of China, and sanctions were imposed by the US. China became unable to import the necessary commodities of iron, steel, oil, rubber, and so on, all of which, of course, were available in the Western colonies, which were in the Far East. So Japan decided to take them by force. And as we know, its first step was to destroy the American fleet by invading Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And at the same time, it then began its assault on the various colonies. Hong Kong fell in December 1941, followed by Singapore, and then Rangoon, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia as we now know it, French Indochina, and Thailand. So an extraordinary push to take control of that part of the world. The Allies, of course, were unable to support China militarily. We were heavily engaged elsewhere, and our role was supplying China as best we could. That was done initially through the Burma Road, which was opened in 1939. And then when Japan got control of Burma, obviously the Burma Road was closed. And from then on, supplies were brought in by air from Assam in India over what they called the hump, in other words, the southern end of the Himalayas. So the FAU teams found themselves in Burma fleeing the Japanese invasion and escaped. Two parties escaped into India, and the rest of them retreated into China. The Japanese advance stalled at the Salween River, and they didn't cross any further into China at that point. And while the FAU, the Friends Ambulance Unit, thought they were going to replicate the First World War ambulance work that they had done then on the Western Front, there was in fact no military ambulance work to be done. So it then had to reinvent itself with a new role. And it became, in effect, not a military ambulance group, but a sort of civilian prototype Medecins Sans Frontieres. And it basically had two roles. One was doing straight medical work. And over the period from 41 to 52, there were in total 24 medical teams working in hospitals and clinics, often missionary hospitals, doing a whole range of disease prevention, inoculations, anti-malarial work, and so on. So straight conventional medical work. And secondly, the importation and distribution of medical supplies. Because of this loss of industry, any production of equipment, hospital equipment and drugs was totally lost. So it was the Friends Ambulance Unit's role to import those into China, again over the hump from India to Kunming, and to distribute them around the country to civilian and military hospitals, to the Ministry of Health, and to the Chinese Red Cross, and of course, the topic of this talk, to the Chinese industrial cooperatives and the so-called Bailie schools, the vocational schools that they ran. So fingers crossed, I'm now going to advance to the first picture. Those are the medical supplies of the time. Top right, that's labeled to be delivered to Lanzhou out in Gansu, Chongqing, and so on. So they had an office in Calcutta and ordered materials from there. Can you imagine how long and difficult that supply chain was, shipping stuff in from the US and from England? Then by railway up to Assam, and then onto the aircraft down over the hump to Kunming. And the unit had probably approximately 40 trucks, and they had no spares, no tires. None of these things could be imported. No oil or fuel, because that had all been cut off. And you might say no roads. Because of the lack of fuel, they converted their trucks to run on charcoal or charcoal gas. And they did do some remarkable convoys right up to the northwest, about 3,000 kilometers, where there was some availability of fuel, but that wasn't very satisfactory. So it was incredibly tough. It was hot, it was cold, muddy or dusty. Vehicles would constantly break down on the roads, so they would have to do constant on-the-road repairs. There were floods, broken bridges, landslips, unbelievably arduous. And these young unpaid volunteers, many of them were basically just school leavers. So to be thrown into that was extraordinary. And I mean, there you see medical supplies being unloaded from small boats at Chongqing. That one box there, you can see it says IRC. That's the International Relief Committee, which the ambulance unit worked with. And again, same situation. This man is called George Kan. After the Friends Ambulance Unit was disbanded, it was very difficult to keep in touch with the Chinese members, because for them, contact with the foreigners during the early Mao era was an embarrassment, so they couldn't reveal where they were. George Kan was one of the fine Chinese, English-speaking Chinese people who worked for the FAU. And a couple of years ago, I had an email in to say, from a Chinese man to say, my father worked with the Friends Ambulance Unit. His name was George Kan. Remarkable. And again, once more on the foreshore on the Yangtze River at Chongqing, that's the South Bank, stuff being loaded into lorries. That is a picture of the Friends Ambulance Unit's transport depot in Chongqing, 4.5 miles from the Yangtze River. You can see it's probably spring because in the rice field down at the bottom, that is a nursery bed for rice. It's been planted there and will later be planted out. Obviously, every little inch is planted with vegetables, and there are the trucks in the yard. Building in the middle is a mud building in which the foreign members lived in pretty appalling conditions. Rats and lizards and all sorts of creatures crawling everywhere. That's another angle view of it. Again, you can see the trucks in the yard. And this is one of my favorite pictures. That's one of the few properly engineered motor roads in China built by the nationalists to link up southern China, to enable them to rush troops in if there was any sort of communist uprising. And there you can see the Friends Ambulance Unit transport depot with trucks in the yard. This road is the key road going south from Chongqing down to Guiyang and Kunming, going down to the south. And it remains the route of the road. This is now a 4-lane highway. Running overhead, there is a straddle beam monorail with a vast overhead station. And now all of this is deep in tower blocks of 20 and 30 stories, like Manhattan. There's a school and a university right on this site, so it's totally unrecognizable. This is one of the first of several shots I'm going to show you of group photos, from which I think the lessons are that the foreigners, the foreign members of the FAU didn't hold themselves above the locals. They all just mucked in together. They were truck drivers, mechanics. They all got their hands dirty together, and that I think is impressive. And I think the other lesson from the picture is that one tends to think Friends Ambulance Unit, people coming in from Europe to do stuff. In fact, most of it was done by Chinese employees. Huge bands, possibly 100, 150 employees doing all the same sort of ancillary work, working with trucks and distributing medical supplies across the country. There again, another one. This is the transport depot in Chongqing. Lots of the British are not sort of standing there at the front as the bosses. They're sort of hidden away. There's Tony Reynolds, Len Bonsall, the transport director at that point. His family live in Australia, and they still have that leather jacket in their possession. They were really rather good at these photographs. I think that's a great group photograph. This was a group moving depots from one point to another, and somewhere along the way they stopped inevitably to take pictures, which everybody loved doing. Again, the Chongqing Transport Depot with Jack Jones there, the author of all the materials that I collated for the book. And again, the sort of nice feeling that the British are not held above their local colleagues. They're all sitting on the floor, arms around each other, sitting in the dust, just like their mates. This picture was one of the ones that really sort of started up my interest in the whole thing. The man sitting on Jack Jones's left, the guy with the fair hair, is Howell Jones. Howell Jones wrote an article to be published in Saku's China Eye. And I got in touch at about this time with Saku through a young man who was incredibly helpful called Rob Stallard. And Rob told me about Howell Jones and put me in touch with him by email. Howell Jones living in Canada, and he and I struck up a great friendship. He sent me his photographs. This is one of them. This photograph, the original, is not much bigger than a postage stamp. And we began a wonderful collaboration in which we tried to work out who everybody was in the picture. And we pretty well succeeded. Everybody, I think, except one of the Chinese men. I don't know who they are. And in fact, I've actually met 3 of these men here and know all of their life stories and have been in touch with all of their families. And that was the process which enabled me to write the book. And from the families, borrowing their photographs, discovering their memoirs is what has enabled me to write the book, as well as using the archives in the Friends Library in London. Another group photograph. A particular friend of mine was Peter Mason, who's standing at the back in the white T-shirt. When he went out to China, when he landed in Hong Kong, he had his 18th birthday. They were that young. And I gather another intriguing picture. In the middle at the back, the tall man slap dead center is Brian Sorensen, and Teresa Hsu, who's the secretary, and the two of them fell for each other. Brian Sorensen was coming back from Urumqi, took a Chinese army plane to fly into Lanzhou. The plane got lost in bad weather, crashed into a mountain, and he was killed. Teresa Hsu eventually moved to Singapore, where she set up a series of homes for old people. And she died reputedly aged 113, which I can hardly believe, but she was pretty good age. And she was known as Singapore's Mother Teresa. So intriguing, interesting people come out of these experiences. Mark Jones, who joined Rowntree's, a good Quaker company, and became their head of he had a big management role in the company. Again, in the middle there, that's George Can, whose son contacted me. Mark Jones and a group of truckers looking quite swish in all of their leather clothes on their way to Bauchi. Mike Frankton and Sam Yen, lovely study of two young men. Mike Frankton died of COVID a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, sadly. Robert Ruman, an American, was very good with his camera and brought in the first color photographs. And this again is at the South Bank depot. Jack Jones described this man, the driver, Wei Fu Lin, as looking like a mafia gangster. And he does look something like that. Another lovely study. Somehow the color does sort of bring the people to life. One has the feeling that at the old times it was all black and white, but of course it wasn't. And they were all young and vibrant. This was the medical clinic which Jack Jones set up at the South Bank depot in Chongqing. And it was a free clinic for the local people. And they could just come in and see one of the, well, I call them barefaced doctors. In other words, the local Friends ambulance unit, they were sort of dispensing aspirin and so on and doing what they could. But at least they had medicines, they had drugs, and they learnt along the way. On the left, you will see this strange thing which looks a bit like a truck body, the canvas cover of a truck body, which is exactly what it is, but with a flue of a boiler sticking out of it. And that was the unit in which they deloused people and treated them for scabies.
Yeah.
In the winters, people were unable to change their clothes. They wore padded jackets, which become ridden with fleas and lice, and those transmit diseases, skin diseases such as scabies and eczema, and of course also typhus. And in the truck body, they would treat people. And that is Dorothy Ruman, the wife of the photographer, aged about 22 in this picture. And I think that's a wonderful image of a young woman doing what she can, doing humanitarian service, treating the baby for scabies. It was pretty tough. The medical conditions were dangerous. George Hogg died of tetanus. 12 Friends Ambulance Unit men died of one thing or another. This is John Briggs on the rail of the ship going out to China. Sad eyes. He was never to return. Tics must have bitten him. He caught typhus and died of typhus in his early 20s. Remarkably, his parents, after the war in about 1946, went out to China to look for his grave. Douglas Hardy also died of typhus. That's Brian Sorensen, who I mentioned earlier, who died in the plane crash. Pitt Rivet on the right was the son of a Harley Street surgeon, went to Charterhouse School, and he caught polio. And they got him back to Chongqing and got him to hospital, but sadly he too died. Bob Aldy, a Canadian, came out by ship to China, and very shortly after arriving, got appendicitis, had his appendix removed in the hospital there. It became infected, and he died. And he and Pip Rivet were buried in the hills near the Friends High School. Charterhouse School has got a project to go and visit all of the graves of people who died, of their alumni who died in the war. And they came out and I set them up, and they tried to find these graves of those two Friends Ambulance Unit men, but they failed to find it. So that's the sign to the Friends High School. And it's rather remarkable that the school now celebrates its origins in a foreign church. They're no longer afraid of the fact that they were set up by foreigners, but celebrate the fact. So as well as the medical dangers, of course, there were many other dangers of being in China. One of the dangers on the road was bandits. You would be held up because obviously the value of your cargoes was huge. Jack Jones was held up by bandits and very severely beaten.
Oh, okay.
Then the roads were pretty hazardous. That's the 24 bends in Guizhou province. And you can see just right at the bottom, there's a little maggot, which is in fact, of course, a truck. The charcoal burning trucks only had about half their power. And so to get up the hill might take half a day. That's a shot, again, the 24 bends looking down. And another typical scene in mountainous China, of which much of it is mountainous. And so very, very arduous driving and dangerous. The road system was almost non-existent. So really they're old donkey tracks that the trucks had to cross. And again, that's a pretty remarkable road cut into the side of the mountain overlooking the river. Again, on the route to Baoqi. And if you got broke down, if you got bogged down, you had to get yourself pulled out however you could. That's Mark Jones, whose truck went off the edge of a ravine and fell many hundreds of feet into the valley. There were about 5 FAU men on top. They were all thrown clear and remarkably survived. Mark went down to the bottom, and there he is swinging off the wreck of his truck. What a survivor. And there it is being dragged back up the hill, and of course it'll be patched up and will go on its way.
Yeah,
Sometimes when they couldn't recover them, they literally dismantled them at the bottom and brought them up bit by bit. That's a 4-wheel drive American truck getting through difficult conditions. So breakdowns, running off the road, going off the edge, roads collapsing, bridges collapsing. How they ever got through, I don't know. They might have averaged journeys of several thousand miles, averaging 15 miles an hour in appalling climatic conditions. And of course, rivers got in the way, and there were inadequate bridges. Bridges collapsed, and of course, sometimes a little ferry like this one. That's a nice example of a charcoal burning truck. You can see behind the cab, that's where some of the equipment is to burn the charcoal and turn it into gas, and you can see the hoppers underneath. That is Wilf Jackson, who I'll mention in a moment. There we have a map of the Burma Road, China in the middle, Burma on the left, Indochina or Vietnam on the right, and you can see the road coming up from Lashio through to Yunnan Phu or Kunming, and that was the route over which supplies were brought in originally. So that is, the scale is quite big. That's, as it says at the bottom, 725 miles. So with the daughter of Wilf Jackson, who was in the truck I've just shown you, that's Carol and his daughter in the distance. And we had a wonderful 2 weeks in southwest China, tracing the line of the Burma Road. And that's one of the few remaining fragments of the Burma Road which still exists. There again. And you can see the cobbles that were used. They had huge numbers of people sitting on the side of the road, chipping stone, turning into cobbles to surface the road, and those scraps are still there. What did old China look like? This is Baoshan in Yunnan province, which was shortly after bombed and smashed up by the Japanese. That's Kunming. This is Chujing, the walls. And of course, sadly, most of the walls of these old cities have gone. That's the inside Chujing, teeming with people, full of life and character. And can you imagine as a 18-year-old school leaver being thrown into that and having to make a life and achieve what you had to do? Quite a challenge. That's the Chujing transport depot, which was built for the purpose. These are shots of trucks inside that depot. So obviously they had major workshops, they had lathes, all sorts of equipment, because with the lack of spares, if they couldn't obtain the spares, they had to make them. That's the beginning of a convoy. Cameras often came out when a convoy was leaving. 3 trucks heading off. Again, a new convoy here. Assembling a convoy with some passengers on board. And that's where they traveled, on top at the front. And of course, if it was winter and it was cold and raining, they just got totally soaked. On the right is Dr. Bob McClure, who was a Canadian who was the medical director. And that's another shot of him on the right, looking quite military. One of the factors was that they could only travel into areas of China held by the nationalists. They couldn't go across into communist China, but in fact they got permission from the nationalists to allow them to do one convoy into China. And this I found in the archives in the Friends library. A letter written by Bob McClure, who you've just seen, to Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the wife, of course, of Chiang Kai-shek, the generalissimo or head of state, begging to be allowed to take a convoy into China to support, in effect, their enemies, the communists. And with diplomatic pressure from the Americans, this was achieved. So a convoy of three trucks was put together with medical supplies and headed off to Yunnan in north of Xi'an. But it all went wrong. Took them months to get permission, took them months to put the loads together and load up 3 trucks. 2 miles away from the depot, heading down the hill into the Yangtze Valley, one of the trucks lost control and went off the edge, and they lost it. Imagine how awful that must have been. Of course, they had to pull it out, get back to the depot, and do it all over again. But they eventually got there over the sort of 3,000-kilometer journey. That's a shot of a Fantien or a little cafe where they used to eat. And that's how on a convoy you'd sleep. You wouldn't want to sleep in the inns because of the lice and the risk of getting typhus. So they slept on the roof of the cab of the truck. Now, changing gear a bit. This is Rui Ali. So we've been talking talking so far about the Friends Ambulance Unit. And the topic of my talk is obviously about how the Friends Ambulance Unit supported the Chinese industrial cooperatives and the so-called Bailie schools. Rui Ali was a New Zealander who was one of the key leaders or promoters of the Chinese industrial cooperatives, trying to set up substitute industry for that which had been lost to the Japanese. He came to China and worked in Shanghai as a factory inspector, and slowly moved across to running this project, which was largely the creation of himself, people like Edgar Snow and other foreigners, and supported by Sung Mei-ling, the wife of Chiang Kai-shek, who I've just mentioned. And I've found several photographs of him, and he's very distinctive. And there we are. That is Rui Ali, standing in front of the logo of the CIC, the Chinese Industrial Cooperatives. So it was a very ambitious project, but remarkably successful in many ways. And at its height had about 3,000 cooperatives or small factories, making things like soap, candles, leather goods, charcoal, timber, bricks, bags, paper, fabric, including bandages, tarpaulins, blankets, and uniforms, to support their army in the fight against the Japanese and to provide employment and products generally. It became well known in the West. It was well promoted, and its slogan was "gung ho," and that is where we have our phrase. It's gone into the language, to be gung ho, to be enthusiastic, and to work optimistically. So as well as as production in industrial production, the other thing that was needed was to train technicians, and so they set up these vocational schools to rehabilitate young refugee boys and orphans and to develop their skills to work in the cooperatives. And they used the title Bailie schools, in honor of an American missionary, Joseph Bailie, who had come up with that idea of creating a home for orphans, giving them a life, a family, straight education, and technical training. So the one that we first come across is the Bailie School, the Shuangqipu Bailie School. That is, this is a sketch of Rui Ali photographing Bailie schoolboys in front of the next to a logo of the CIC, and this comes from Graham Peck's wonderful book, which includes information on his visit to Shuangqipu. As I go through these photographs, which I've collected from various families, I sort of look for George Hogg, and I've never found him, but look for Rui Ali. I think that's him there sitting at that table, a lovely group photo. And crossing a frozen river, I think probably at Shandan, but again, I think on the right is Rui Ali. And you can see the CIC logo in the middle at the back of this meeting. And I think that's Rui Ali sitting there. And again, a little girl standing in front of a CIC logo. And this photograph is captioned as Old Man of Shuangqipu, which is where the school was. So obviously the focus of our tour to China is the contribution of George Hogg. And George Hogg was a young British pacifist who went out to China in 1938 with his pacifist aunt, Muriel Lester. It hadn't been his intention to stay in China, but stay he did. And he found himself through various iterations working as a journalist in Shanghai, and then moving on to work with the CIC, Chinese Industrial Cooperatives, as a secretary at their headquarters in Baoqi. And then from there on, he became headmaster of the Bailie School at Shuamshipu in March 1942 and was there, I think, for about 3 years. After a time of successful running of the school, there were difficulties in that there was the risk of bombing by the Japanese and of the school being harassed by the Nationalist Army, who, of course, were trying to press gang the young boys and young men to get them into the army. And so to avoid that risk, they discovered a new site for the school about 700 miles further north in Shandan. And the epic story is of their journey from Shuangqipu to Shandan to build the new school, which was done in January 1945. And on this tour we're going to replicate some of that. So the shocking story is that when they got there, not so long after, George Hogg was playing games with the boys, cut his foot, contracted tetanus, and in July 1945 died of tetanus, shockingly, aged only 30. But the wonderful thing is that his life is not forgotten, and there are statues of him, and he was celebrated immediately and well remembered. And of course, now he's a recognized hero of China, as Xi Jinping, on his state visit to England in 2015, in the banquet that was given for him at Buckingham Palace, he specifically mentioned George Hogg, whose service to China should be remembered as a basis for friendship between the two nations. So one of the themes of what I want to talk about is how closely associated the Friends Ambulance Unit and the Chinese industrial cooperatives were, and the contributions that the FAU made to the CIC and to the schools. And one remarkable thing is that I think no fewer than 8 Friends Ambulance Unit members were seconded to these 2 Bailie schools. So the FAU handed these men over to work there and paid all of their costs and expenses. And I'm now going to run through some photographs of some of those Friends Ambulance Unit men. On the right is Courtney Archer, a New Zealander who was worked with Rui Ali, mainly at Shandan for 6 years, and he's been described as Rui Ali's right-hand man. Here's a picture of him not in the tough circumstances of Shandan, where I'm sure they look much more rough and ready. But here he is in Shanghai, pretty smartly dressed. And again on the right in Shanghai, one of the great supporters of the CIC and the Bailie schools. And second from the left again. He was there, this letter written by him to an FAU contact in Hong Kong is January 1952. So he was probably the last Friends Ambulance Unit member to be in China. So in 1952, several years after the Communist Revolution, he's still there, still running the place. And I have this Friends Ambulance Unit or Friends Service Unit claim sheet. This is him claiming his expenses from the FAU. Intriguing how humble it is. The main item is food. The next one is coal. And there are things like torch batteries, toothpaste, straw mat. It's a very basic life. And he had to go through all the complexity of claiming all his costs from the FAU. And it was pretty difficult because transferring money across China was kind of impossible. Anthony Cohen, also FAU, was seconded to the Shandan Bailie School. He ran the hospital there after a Dr. Spencer left. He came off his motorbike and fractured his skull, and remarkably he survived and became a lecturer in Chinese at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Now, this is a remarkable thing. This is Andy Braid, and I do believe that his daughter has joined this session. So a wonderful man. One of his special characteristics is that he was a Scot, and he brought with him his bagpipes. So to entertain people, he would play the bagpipes. How extraordinary that must have been out in the middle of, on the edge of the Gobi Desert. Another shot of him here. And he features in George Hogg's book, I See a New China. George Hogg was the secretary in Bauchi, and he was followed by this man, again, FAU, Peter Townsend, who wrote a very fine book about China afterwards in 1955, and became in London a specialist in art, and particularly in Chinese art, of which he had a substantial collection. Again, looking remarkably clean. And again, that is in Shanghai, where obviously conditions were very much better. I couldn't resist putting this picture in because in George Hogg's book, mention is made of a parliamentary delegation that went out to China to visit them. And I think this may be a photograph of it. People standing under the wing of a C-47 American plane. And most interestingly, one could see the very clear features of Joseph Needham standing there under the wing. A lot of where both Shuangqipu and Shandan were on a route, in effect, from Chongqing or Chengdu, coming north and going out into the Gobi towards Lanzhou. And the trucks would often go that way, delivering medical supplies to Lanzhou or to the Bailie schools. And these trucks are standing in a yard in Lanzhou. This was Parry Jones with a convoy, which, as you can see, is loaded with oil drums. They were going up to Suzhou, further the oil fields further north, and they would pass through Shuangqipu and Shandan, going up there to buy fuel. You can see how cold it was. Joseph Needham wore a leather jacket just like that. Okay. Now this is Shuangqipu, where the first Bailie school was, with this rather unusual conical hill. Look how it's stripped of vegetation. Those are the conditions of poverty when every inch, every leaf, every stick is stripped to use for cattle fodder, to use for fires and cooking. Again, another shot of it, slightly better vegetated. And the river below in Shuangqipu, a caravan of camels which come in from the Gobi Desert, again with the conical hill behind. A National Geographic magazine article with the hill showing there, and another photograph of the CIC premises with the hill behind. And that's my own photograph. A Saku tour visited there in 2016, and that's my view of Shuangqipu as it is currently, with the mountain behind, and see how the vegetation has grown up in better times. It was a great pleasure to go to the local museum and present them with copies of the photographs that I had, which obviously they'd never seen before. To have 1940 photographs presented to them out of the blue was quite a surprise. This is the convoy that was going to the communists in Yan'an. Tony Reynolds in the background, and this is the CIC guest house, and a further view of it down the avenue. Mountain roads in that area, the mountains near Shuangqipu. A truck on its way to Shandan, which has got bogged down. That's George Masson, a member of a large team from New Zealand who worked with the CIC. A truck on the railway being en route to Shandan to the Bailie School. The roads were so bad that if you could cut out a section of the roads and put your trucks onto the railways, you did. and with the convoy that was going to the Maoist communists in Yan'an, that was the engine that drew the convoy, and that's the convoy of 3 trucks on the railway wagons. That's the way you travel. If you can get inside, you're lucky. Otherwise, you go on top. And that's the train coming in from Baoqi to Xi'an. That's the walls of Xi'an. I love that picture. Amazing atmosphere. Now, of course, so different. All of that area around the city is covered in tower blocks. And that's the north gate of Xi'an. Mud houses, now 25-story apartments. Another National Geographic magazine photograph. Indusco, that's another of their trucks on the railway. Indusco, of course, means industrial cooperatives. I don't know who the man is. I haven't identified him. More Indusco trucks on the railways. And now we get to Shandan, the walls, and again, camels outside. Poor quality photograph, but full of atmosphere, I think. And again, you can see how cold it is from the way people are wrapped up. And that is the village of Shandan itself. Probably the only clear picture of it that I've seen. Low-rise pictures with the mountains behind. And the major feature of the town was this Buddhist. Well, the word used is dagoba or stupa, and it is the temple of Ashoka's hair. So there was a relic of King Ashoka, a Buddhist king, supposedly held in the temple, and they were the only substantial buildings. So when George Hogg and his orphans got there, they used those premises to begin to re-establish the school. Again, this building. And the wall of the town with the gate, and you can just see the dagoba on the right. And now a series of very poor quality pictures, but they do get a hint of what it felt like to be a Bailie boy, an orphan, living and working, and being given new opportunities there. I love to draw these paintings on the walls. I don't even know, I have no idea what that is. Some sort of machine, perhaps. All tiny photographs, which I photographed and did my best to enhance. And then the final picture is of Shandan itself. And it's I think a silkscreen picture, which was presumably made by the CIC or by the school. And it's intriguing. This copy has got some of the places marked up on it. And if you look at the bottom, the left-hand red arrow points to, it says at the bottom, Hogg tomb. So that's where George Hogg was buried. So just finally, pretty well out of time. In 1952, the Friends Ambulance Unit had to close down and staff were withdrawn. But obviously it had a huge amount of equipment. What were they going to do with that? Because of the close relationship with the CIC and the Bailie schools, obviously they were going to hand it over to them. So 74 years ago, the FAU was closed, and all of the equipment at the Chongqing depot was loaded up into 16 trucks, and many of the employees there got into those trucks and did what turned out to be a 6-month trip going north across China, and eventually they arrived safely after 6 months in Shandan with all of that precious equipment, lathes, generators, mechanical equipment to boost the work of training all these young people to benefit China. So there we are. The CIC was in many ways a foreign creation supported by foreign institutions with American and New Zealand money and support, and also the extensive support of the Friends Ambulance Unit, without which it could not, of course, have succeeded. So thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you. Wonderful illustration to the talk. Really enjoyed that. Thanks a lot. So next up in May is the talk on George Hogg. So we'll have details sent out via the newsletter, and you'll receive the link well ahead of time. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Andrew.
Okay, my pleasure. Sorry about the technical glitches at the beginning.
Well done.
We got
Made all
there.
the difference.
Okay.